We acknowledge, celebrate and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First People on whose traditional lands we meet and work. Their cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We also acknowledge and celebrate that many of the speakers in this series were based on other traditional lands and territories across Australia and the world. We recognise their past and present leaders and acknowledge their contribution to our collective past and futures. Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics conversation. We're currently exploring the past, present and future of cybernetics. Cybernetics and systems science with a side of global affairs and leadership. Today, we're in conversation with Bill Reckmeyer. We've asked Bill 4 questions. Let's see what he shares.
My background in cybernetics started actually 50 years ago this summer. And I was a doctoral student in Russian studies at American University. I was also working at as research fellow at International Research Institute, which did high-level work for the Secretary of Defense's office. And I found myself a bit frustrated because the American historians didn't talk to the Russian historians, and never the twain shall meet, even though we were just across the hall from each other. And then the same thing is there were other aspects of Russian studies on campus, but we didn't talk to the people in international relations or economics or art and literature. So I was looking for bigger picture kinds of concerns. In looking back on it, and this is prompted sort of by the storytelling approach that Genevieve and her colleagues take on this, I realized that I've always been interested in the big picture. Certainly in college, 3 books that transformed my life were all about big pictures. First one was The Lord of the Rings. The second one was Dune. The third one was Foundation Trilogy. And I just found myself fascinated with all these. I sat down and read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit in one night before a Latin exam because I wasn't interested in studying for the Latin exam. And I was just always fascinated with these bigger pictures that always had threads you had to follow and track. And so the context in grad school was that I started asking questions, got introduced to systems thinking, and primarily just would call people up. So in the original, at the first step, it was Kenneth Boulding in general systems thinking and Heinz von Forrester and Gregory Bates in cybernetics. So I called Boulding up. And he answered the phone and he agreed to talk to me. And then we did more work from there. And in fact, Boulding and von Forrester were readers on my dissertation and sold it because the committee had no clue what I was doing. But this is the early 70s, Washington up with Nixon, didn't think it could ever get any worse than Nixon. Shows you how little I know. And so Joni and I took off for California. I had wanted to go out to California in the summer of love in 1967, but I actually met a girl and fell in love and realized that a life of love is better than a summer of love, so I held off. But I was tired of DC, and we took off with no jobs, no homes, no anything, bought a school bus, took everything we owned and our 270-pound St. Bernard and headed for California. And we were going to the Bay Area because we had friends and connections in San Francisco area. And just before I went, there was an article by Norm Gunderson, who was actually the founder of the Cybernetic Systems program. I didn't found it. I just took care of it the last 15 years. So I called him up. I'd learned that this is the way to do things. You just call people up and a lot of them will answer the phone. And by the time we finished, one, he had made it very clear that San Jose was not down near LA, no matter what Dionne Warwick said. And that second of all, he would love to have me join the Cybernetic Systems program and offered me a half-time position in a field that I had no credentials in and that nobody in my doctoral program could believe because nobody could get a job then in history at that age, in that period of time. So we went out, started teaching, and they quickly made me full-time. And when I finished my dissertation, which is after we had twins and then another daughter, I spent probably the first 15 years of my career really zeroing in on the whole cybernetics and systems community. I organized a number of major international conferences, which allowed me to talk to lots of interesting, important people all over the world who were involved in these fields. And it allowed me to begin to flesh out, because I taught myself systems thinking and cybernetics. I didn't learn it from anybody else. I did a lot of reading, I did a lot of thinking, a lot of talking to interesting people, lots of conversations, lots of stories. We could have a whole series of stories from the early days and with Stafford Beer and Heinz von Forster and Gordon Pask and Kenneth Boulding and Anatole Rappaport. And I could go on and on and on. But for a young guy in a field that he had no credentials in, it was a very turbocharged and heady experience. And it certainly completely changed my life in the sense that it was allowed me to do what I wanted to do. So I spent most of my career, I spent all of my career as a cybernetician and system scientist going into different fields. So fundamentally, I'm a generalist. My whole career is I've been a generalist with working in certain specialized areas that required integrative approaches, collaborative approaches, strategic thinking, and a focus on the big picture. And that was very, very significant because the field gives you an opportunity to have conversations with people and fields in ways that you wouldn't be able to do unless you had a lot of experience in that field. But because of this, you see commonalities across fields, and you have a language for being able to talk about it, and it focuses on questions, not just giving answers. Basically, any door is open to you, whereas in most cases, you couldn't possibly begin a conversation with somebody from a different field unless you were already an expert in that field, because they wouldn't spend time talking with you. And one of the things, I think the kicker for me, if I had to pick one specific trigger, was an article that I read in The Steps to an Ecology of Mind by Bateson, interesting enough, Genevieve. And somebody had said, you're doing some of this systems work in cybernetics. You might take a look at this new book, which had come out just as I was getting going. I believe it was 1972. And I was reading his various stories in there. And the one that grabbed me up short was What is an Instinct? And I've subsequently read a lot of other things and familiar with much of the literature. But that article really spoke to the fundamental question that I had at the time, which was, because my degree, remember, is in history. So I was interested in what makes an historical fact? How do you agree on what an historical fact is? How do you figure out who's making it, okay, and who's saying it? So that conversation that Bateson had with his daughter, his imaginary daughter, who I then became a close friend with Mary Catherine Bateson, was fundamentally that it's an explanatory device, because we don't know what we're doing, but it underscored the importance of epistemology. And I don't think we should spend as much time as many cyberneticians are currently doing, going down the rabbit hole where all they do is the cybernetics of epistemology and the epistemology of cybernetics. But it's really important to recognize that there are no facts or data or information independent of whoever's doing them. And that's cybernetic too. So that was huge for me. And in the first 15 years, I spent my focus on cybernetics and systems. And then I got this Kellogg National Leadership Fellowship, which opened a lot of other doors at just the same time that San Jose State was closing down the cybernetic systems program for a variety of administrative and financial reasons, even though we were extremely successful. And it was the perfect place to be in Silicon Valley at the time. So I spent the rest of my career doing whatever I wanted. I was already a tenured full professor. I taught in 7 or 8 different colleges, within San Jose State in multiple fields. I got heavily involved the rest of my career on leadership issues, a lot of strategic projects, a lot of focus on global affairs. I spent most of my time over the last 50 years, about half of it as a professor and half of it as a practitioner, leading strategic change projects. Some of them were studies for the federal government, but a lot of them were hands-on organizational community change activities. So I think I'll stop there. That's probably enough for now.
Well, and Bill, I love the way that in your approach to cybernetics, you've woven together both the kind of having conversations and getting out there and asking questions with the kind of the thread of family and the importance of the people around you, which I think sometimes we often make disappear from the stories of academic work, but which are also really critical. And the idea of grabbing serendipity by the neck is one that I think I will carry with me for a while. And it gives us a really good backdrop into your expertise and the kind of the framing of some of your work that we'll all get a chance to read and look at. And so the rest of the questions really point a bit more to kind of some of that experience and expertise you've had. So if we could move on to question 2 in cybernetics past, you've mentioned one kind of enlightening cybernetic work already, but I wonder if you could tell us about a favorite tool or approach or theory or personal story from cybernetics and why.
I could give you stories, and I know you'd love to have lots of stories, but given we have a half an hour and I've already spent too much time on the origins. But the thing I think is most important for people, because there are a lot of different interpretations of what cybernetics is. And all of them are accurate in the sense that the field can take a look at human-machine interfaces or feedback systems or information systems, et cetera, and computers and artificial intelligence, all of which falls within the domain. But I think it's important to send the message out when you're talking about cybernetics is that if first and foremost, it is about purposeful systems. It is the ability of certain kinds of systems to engage in goal-directed behavior in ways that allow them to steer their activities to achieve those goals. And they do that because they're able to transcend lots of natural constraints, physical constraints, biological constraints, et cetera. So for me, the most important point that I would make, given the part of what you asked me about, Amy, which was taking a look at leadership, taking a look at Mary Catherine Bates and taking a look at global affairs, et cetera, to refocus the field on that this is about human cyberneticity is the most important thing that this field of cybernetics is about, is enabling it to focus not just on the machines or other elements, but to recognize that cybernetic capabilities are the most profoundly emergent property in the known universe. 14 plus billion years, everything else, most aspects in the universe, most phenomena are subject to basic physical forces, or at least as we know on our planet, some biological forces. But any system that has cybernetic capabilities has the ability to transcend various kinds of constraints to some extent and exercise a degree of autonomy, undertake actions, engage in agency, which allows you to cause other things to happen. And this is really rare. And we need to understand it. So what the history of the human experience has been, and the growth of our cyberneticity over the last 200,000 years, and then especially in the last 500 years, is that we have our basic biological cybernetic capabilities, but then we've been expanding them so that we're creating cybernetic capabilities through social interactions and groups and organizations. And it starts with small communities, it goes to bigger communities and nation states, and et cetera. But it also includes our ideas, the neurological or the intellectual, that allows us to really, really take advantage of these capabilities. And then also the creation of the technology. So when I first stumbled onto your school through connections, just because I was visiting my new granddaughters down in Australia, and sort of fell into this, I feel like Alice in Wonderland, sort of, you fall through this hole and you're never sure what you're going to get. And it turns out to be this marvelous new school you're building there and taking it. The technology, I don't know much about artificial intelligence, but I've known all along that it's a credible extension of human capabilities and cyberneticity. And therefore, we ought to understand and appreciate that. When you talk to most people, and I'll close with this comment, over the years, the most valuable point I've been able to make to people is to have them understand the basic process of cybernetics, of detecting, selecting, effecting, and correcting, okay? Because the vast majority of people don't understand that. They don't know what that's about, even other experts. And so we have a responsibility as cyberneticians that if we want to be able to communicate with people, and especially if we want to be able to help them, it's our responsibility to make that leap. It's not to swoop in and helicopter in as if we've got all this expertise and assume that they're going to figure out how to pay attention to us because we're subject matter experts. It's our responsibility to figure out where they are and figure out how we can communicate with them and interact with them and help them. And this has been the most fundamental to folks. Why? Because most people that I've run into, and this is at a professional level, it's also at a personal level, when you deal with just everyday folks talking about getting through life, they're not interested in what you know. They're interested in what you do and how you can help them do whatever is important to them, do it better. That's what they're really interested in. And so this field has allowed me to do that. And we could have a lot of other specific examples if we had further kinds of snack talks and you asked a different set of prompts, Amy, I would have completely different kinds of action. But this is enough for now.
Well, absolutely. And you raise a really good point there. On the one hand, Bill, we can ask different questions and get different answers. And, you know, hearing your answer to that, I'm almost certain that at least one other speaker in this series probably has a different take on things to you around this kind of model as well. So it'll be, you know, I'm already thinking, how do we get you all in a room at the end of the series to have a conversation collectively? But we might work on that later. I think your final comment there for me really, though, bridges into the next question, which is really, you know, could you give us an example of cybernetics and its action in the world, the way that it has the potential to create change, or the way you've used it to create change in the world?
Yeah, what the point that I would emphasize, and again, I didn't say this at the beginning and I meant to, is just that I got so wrapped up in the flow of the conversation but I really wanted to underscore that this is my perspective on cybernetics. I do not speak for the field. And in fact, there are many others in the field would not be happy with me speaking the way that I am about it. But the point is, this is my view. I think there's some value in it. And I think all of us bring value to it in different ways. So you have to recognize that it's very much grounded in my experience, my background, the same way that Genevieve spoke so eloquently.
Well, and in that respect, I suppose it's a field with an awful lot of opportunities and the opportunity to see yourself in it. And on the other hand, deeply exasperating that people have different perspectives.
Well, I do think it is. And I think my view is partly because I haven't been wrapped up so much in the field where that's all that was about my identity. It's not only about being a cybernetician. Professionally, that is my primary identity. But there are a lot of other identities, you know, family, basketball, things like that. But within the field, I think it's really, really critical to recognize, and then I can give you all the systemic reasons about why it's incumbent upon us to be able to communicate with people. For me, the one I wanted to emphasize here, and partly because you asked about it, but also because I probably would have chosen this as the first one, is the ability to exercise leadership. Leadership is a profoundly intentional, purposeful activity. The value of why leadership is so important is that it's an amplifier. It's a tremendous amplifier of being able, because leadership is best defined as mobilizing people to work on and achieve shared goals. That's what it's about. So rather than all of us getting together and thinking that this is what, you know, we can do whatever we want and just add it up, or the other end of it, which is typical views of leadership, which is that it's all resides in the person who's doing the leading, who's the leader. The fundamental systemic approach and the cybernetic approach, and you've shown some of this in some of the publications that the schools come out with that I've read, is that it recognizes that it occurs not just in the individuals, it's in the context of the social system that you're interacting with. And it can be an organization, it can be a community, it can be at a national level, et cetera. But the real fundamental challenge facing the species is how do we develop an ability to collaborate and work together to achieve shared goals, because you can't just assume that they're going to automatically emerge out of our interactions of independent cybernetic behaviors. So in my case, I used it in lots of different fields, in different settings. And a lot of it was in practical change efforts that are primarily in organizations, higher education, high tech, nonprofit groups. But it's also intellectual leadership, thought leadership, the ability to put out points out there where you can do position papers or studies or anything else that can shift where people are going and what they're doing. But it's that amplifying capability of being able to enhance the collective that is greater than the sum of the parts rather than less than the sum of the parts. And if you can do so with a conscious understanding of how leadership is a cybernetic process and use those tools, even if you don't use the language or use explicit terms because it doesn't fit with where people are, that you're helping them or working with them, it's tremendously beneficial. And to me, that's because that in itself can be used in any one of these. I can give you all kinds of specific examples. So I know I'm cheating because I'm not really picking a specific example. But the key thing here is not the specific example, it's the meta level lesson, which is leadership really matters, especially if it's the right kind of leadership, not the wrong kind of leadership. Genevieve mentioned the Kellogg Fellowship, which was that and the White House Fellows Program were the two premier leadership programs in the world back when I was going in. And I didn't want anything to do with it. People had encouraged me to apply for it, and I wasn't interested because it was about leadership. And in my foolishness, I thought leadership was just like political leadership as I'd seen in Washington, D.C., and I didn't want anything to do with it. But when I saw the ad, and it was for interdisciplinary global approaches, wow, I said, okay, I'll apply for that. So 20,000 applicants a year, they choose 40 to 45 people. I got the gold ring. That's the biggest lottery prize I've ever had in my life, other than Joni and the kids and family and friends and stuff. So it allowed you to get into it. And I began to realize that this was a real leverage point for being able to help people work together on the kinds of complex challenges, full of ambiguity, uncertainty, et cetera. And it can go in lots of different directions.
Well, Bill, and I know that you said you were cheating on the question, but on the slide here in front of us, we have a load of different examples that clearly are things you've worked on. So what we might try and do is work with you afterwards to try and pull a few out that we could put on the snack pack for people to look at later as well, some of the reports and things you've been involved in, which would be really wonderful. I think the lesson of leadership as a powerful amplifier and a point of leverage is a really, really critical one as we move forward with our work too. Which leaves us with 5 minutes for the last question, just okay. Cybernetics future and imagining a cybernetics for the future. What's one thing you would add or change or do differently or include? The floor is yours.
Well, this is where I wanted to go. This is where everything else was leading to. Partly because of the questions with respect to Bates and partly because of the interest in global affairs. And a lot of my focus has been both on policymaking, national policymaking, but also global affairs, global issues in general. I think we're in the midst of major changes, unprecedented changes in human history. That's the best term for it I found is the Anthropocene. I think it consists of both planet-centric issues and people-centric issues, and they're all interconnected. It's not a question. The people who try to say which is more important, climate change or social justice, don't understand the context and the situation. They're all important. They're all interconnected. You have to deal with all of them as interconnected parts of this bigger whole. Dealing with those issues requires, I think, an understanding of how we created them. So my focus would be on this, and this is part of the project that I shared with Catherine and Maya early on, is about, I think we should be thinking about human beings as reaching a stage of Homo cyberneticus, not Homo sapiens. The most distinguishing, important characteristic of humanity is not that our brains and we're smart, it's that we're able to use those and do something that makes a difference. And so in this particular case, if you take a look at human history for the last 200,000 years, past 10,000 years, it's a giant hockey stick. I think most people have seen some graphs like this with respect to the Anthropocene, and it's just flat. And then all of a sudden, starting about 300 years ago, everything involved with humanity in terms of population, prosperity, et cetera, goes through the roof compared to what it had been for most of our existence. All of that was created, I'm convinced, especially based on the research that I've been doing for the last 3 years, on a significant expansion of human cyberneticity. It started around 1500 AD. Is partly the scientific revolution, but is also partly stumbling on to the Western Hemisphere and getting the biggest lottery prize in history in the sense of all the wealth and all the resources that are available there and a variety of other factors. But if we want to understand how to manage the Anthropocene so that it's not just a complete mess, and we just keep running to the edge of this cliff as we're going over. Remember that ad years ago from Apple with all the lemmings going over the cliff? Well, that's what we're doing as a species right now. We're also caught up in our look. So I think it's important to understand not only the science of human cyberneticity, but also the history of how that has played out. Okay, and anthropologists, arguably, I would say, are better than any of the social sciences or any of the others for being able to appreciate why that stuff's significant and how context matters. And anthropology has arguably been more focused in emphasizing cybernetic and systems approaches than any of the other traditional fields. So I see these two major paradoxes, cybernetic paradoxes. One is human purpose, which grows out of all of our autonomy, and we keep exercising our human purpose. And it's been tremendously beneficial in increasing prosperity, but it's also causing all kinds of problems. And the same thing's happening with the prosperity paradox in the sense of those positives. So Gregory, I'll close with just the comment that Gregory Bateson made the observation that in a conference at Mary Catherine Bateson's first book on our own metaphor about we got to be careful about the downsides of human purpose. And so my point, to be succinct, is I don't know how many of you have ever heard of or remember Lester Thoreau, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist. And in the late 70s, as I was beginning to really percolate this and pull it together, he was the dean of the business school at Yale, which is a pretty impressive place. And they were interviewing him. And I think I have the quote pretty close. He said, "So what do you think about the current state of economics?" And he paused for a moment. And he said, "Well, the problem with the economic profession is they're spending all their time building all these wildly, interesting, brilliant, sophisticated theoretical ships, when what we need is a raft that floats." So I don't think that we should be spending as much time trying to fine-tune cybernetics as we should be in using cybernetics effectively to enhance the exercise of human cyberneticity in both more effective and more responsible ways. I'm not against trying to continually improve the field, but my focus is not on which part of the field. It's what do we need to do to use it so that we can handle this emerging world that we've been creating unconsciously. I'm not worried about myself, not really worried about my daughters and their generation, but my 3 granddaughters, they're going to be living in a world that is profoundly chaotic and compared to the way it's been, unless we start doing something, acting a little more intelligently and being effective in doing that. And I think cybernetics is the key to being able to do so.
Want more? Check out the snack pack in the video description for bonus content and resources.